Welcome to Managing Sexuality Intelligently. My name is Jason, and I'm here with Stephen Ng, marriage and family therapist. Thank you for joining us, Stephen.
Yeah, of course.
You keep coming back for more. Just waiting for the day where you don't show up. Today we're talking about sex addiction. I grew up thinking sex addiction was real. I heard stories of celebrities and other famous people being sex addicts. So in my mind, I'm like, yeah, that's a real thing. And it also made sense because when I was 15, I was like, oh yeah, sex is somewhat addicting, especially if you're famous and you have hordes of women coming after you. So that's kind of how I thought about it. But
we're not going to talk about David Duchovny, right?
No, we can if you want. But then, like working with Steve, I found a different take on it. And in one of the articles Steve wrote for Psychology Today, he wrote, after years of research and scientific debate, sex addiction is not actually a recognized mental illness. So we'll get into all that. But before we do, if you have a question for Steve, visit stephening.com and fill out the contact form. At the end of each episode, Steve will answer a listener question. So be sure to stay tuned for that. Okay, Steve, sex addiction. I'd like to start with the phrase itself, sex addiction. Like, where did this come from?
Oh, wow. Historically, I just don't even know, but I have a feeling it's something, I would guess something religious, but I really can't say. It's in a long line, though, the idea of pathologizing an undesirable behavior, or at least a behavior undesirable by some, has got a long and ancient tradition that goes way, way back, including, in more recent centuries. There was a disease that was identified by physicians in the 1800s in which people who were slaves had an irrepressible desire to escape. And that was defined as a mental illness. Mm-hmm. And punishment was apparently the only way you could, break a slave of that pathological desire to escape what were obviously wonderful conditions. I mean, all their shelter and food was paid for.
Yeah.
So
that's all you needed.
Yeah. And centuries before that, it was people who had mood disorders and, using the Aristotelian theory of the four humors, it was believed that we needed to bleed these people and that would cure them. Mm. So putting leeches on them or making a cut and then stitching it up, or bandaging it. If there was enough blood taken in the mind of the physician, of course, if the symptoms persisted, you had to keep doing it over and over. And I've never seen an article on, probably have to write one now, on people, at least some people, deciding something is undesirable and pathological, but without any evidence to the contrary. They go ahead and take extreme measures to eliminate the behavior.
So that's how people classify sex addiction then? They say it's just something that's, people make it, someone wants sex a lot, so then they say it's undesirable, or like, how does that?
Well, we define sex addiction. I love this definition that has been going around for some years. A sex addict is anyone who wants sex more than you do.
That's the definition?
Right.
Okay.
And isn't that helpful? Because it makes it super easy to diagnose, because you're not going to admit, especially if it were two men talking in a church and one has been diagnosed as a sex addict, the other guy is never going to come clean and say, well, I want sex as often as he does, or I like sex as much as he does. So we have a lot of shame around human sexuality, and we pathologize it when it's in the extremes. And when I say in the extremes, I only mean in the eye of the beholder. Mm-hmm. So if she wants sex more than he does, then we have to have conversations about nymphomania, which is another mental health disorder. But again, it's based on the idea that women shouldn't want sex more than the men they're with.
It is nymphomania in the same category as sex addiction, where it's not
a thing.
Not a thing.
Yeah, right. It's a little bit like, I mean, all the pseudosciences, gosh, phrenology, which was current all the way through the 20th century. I think even Hitler had some interest in phrenology. There are people who believe in all kinds of so-called scientific cures that the rest of the scientific community doesn't believe in typically, and sex addiction is rather like that. So the way that this, like so many things, it's driven by money. In a lot of cases, the therapists who provide sex addiction treatment usually provide it in clinics that are extremely expensive, and when they go to bill the insurance companies to pay for the sex addiction treatment, they never use the term sex addiction because it's not recognized by the mental health community. Instead, they diagnose him with anxiety disorder or depression or some other sort of disorder that will be covered by insurance, but it's really essentially insurance fraud.
Yeah. So if somebody, I mean, because I guess an addict is somebody who uses something to an extent where it causes harm. Is that kind of a broad definition?
I think that's a pretty fair layman's definition right there, because the general rule in psychotherapy is a behavior isn't a problem unless it causes problems. Mm-hmm. So if my sexual behavior is of such a nature that it causes problems, not just in the judgment of another human being, but in terms of objectively describing my own life, I no longer find myself capable of holding a job. It interferes with my work, my health, my relationships with my community and others. Then, yeah, we have the hints of a problem there.
But it wouldn't be called sex addiction.
No, and really, when you eliminate all of that, really what it is it seems to be a trespass of my moral religious beliefs, most typically. And it generally, in my experience at least, you didn't ask me this question, but what I've observed so far in terms of the umbrella term intelligent management of sexuality, sex addiction seems to be the result of, after people have tried to repress their sexuality and been unsuccessful, they end up expressing their sexuality in ways that are really rather flagrantly immoral in the eyes of their community. The use of prostitutes, multiple affairs, compulsive masturbating, and in all of that, gosh, there's a tendency to want to see it as addiction, but it's really different. And I think for the listener who can remember the movie with Helen Hunt and Jack Nicholson called As Good as It Gets, Jack Nicholson's character has OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And he comes home and locks the door multiple times in a specific number of times. And if he gets interrupted, or if anyone with a ritual like this gets interrupted, they have to start all over again because the ritual has to be done properly one time in order to reduce the anxiety. But we would never say Jack Nicholson's character had a lock addiction or a hand washing addiction, which is another one of his behaviors in the movie.
Yeah. So, but addiction too, it's something like, when I think of addiction too, it's something that we can't control in a way, to some extent too.
Well, there's an impulse, a craving, if you will, that for true addiction, like say with a substance, there's a craving for that substance, and I become increasingly uncomfortable until I get that substance. So I think of the typical heroin addict or the alcoholic who has delirium tremens or starts getting the shakes, or the addict who is using heroin who feels pain in their abdomen. That's really what we mean by addiction. Yeah. But a craving for sex, when one is starved for sex, is really more like a craving for food when one is starved of food. Now, food is kind of a good corollary to this, because a man and a woman who get married, he could weigh 200 pounds to her 100 pounds, but we would never say he should only eat as much as she finds suitable, or that she should be forced somehow to eat as much as he needs to eat.
Yeah.
They are each very different in their appetites for nourishment. And in the same way, the human species has a broad spectrum of sexual appetite, and that's comfortable for us. And it's genetically driven. And without, if we go one way or the other, if I force myself to have more sex than I want, I feel uncomfortable. If I force myself to have less sex than I'm comfortable with, I feel uncomfortable. And now, of course, I have to learn how to manage that.
Yeah.
So it doesn't help when my only intelligent management of sexuality training comes from my church, where they're saying, yeah, anything outside of marriage is a sin. And, oh, yeah, just for good measure, cherry on top, masturbation is also a sin. There's no acceptable amount of masturbation. And there's a lot of other stuff. If you'll just give us a minute, we'll think about it, like sex with the dead or sex with the same-sex partner or sex with Moabites or any of that other stuff. So when people go to manage their sexuality, the first step is acceptance of self. I am a sexual being. And to figure out what are my sexual norms. For some people, it's going to be perfectly normal to want absolutely zero sex. The asexuals crave zero sex. For others, it's going to be absolutely normal to crave sex once a month, or even less. And for still others, I've had clients who've their norm, and they were happily married, who wanted to have sex 4 times a day, and fortunately, they found a partner who was exactly the same way, and so they were happily having sex 4 times a day.
Saves money on hobbies, I guess.
And I'm not really on anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, they almost, I mean.
So that's a lot of time.
I never did time them or ask them how long does it take, but because for some people, somebody said statistically the average American intercourse duration was something under 5 minutes. And
that was the average American intercourse?
Yeah, and I've had plenty of males come to me complaining of that. And I always ask them, so how often do you have sex? They give me a number, and I ask them, how often would you like to be having sex? And the number is always much higher. The second number is much higher. So really, I think what's going on is they're just simply starved for sex.
Yeah, I feel like that's mostly a women's argument. Like it's only lasting 5 minutes, like with the guy.
Oh, the complaint?
Well, yeah, and it's like the guy is typically going quicker, but it seems like, I don't know if that's just the story in my head, or that's kind of like what it seems.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of us who are not therapists, we depend on cultural depictions of sexuality for a lot of our information. So the myths would be all sex offenders recidivate. That's not true at all. They're far from, they're the least likely to reoffend in their crimes. All men, if men ejaculate or have sex with a woman, they are far more likely to finish before she does, or men are far more likely to ignore her sexual needs. And then there's similar generalizations about women. Women don't want sex as often as men do. And none of this is true because men and women as a group don't have sex. Only individuals have sex with us.
Yeah.
I mean, with all due respect to the people into orgies listening to this, most of us have sex one at a time with another person, and that's really what we're dealing with. And sadly, we don't do our due diligence before we get into monogamous committed relationships. We often assume, well, of course, we'll have sex less frequently once we get married, or more frequently once we get married.
And it's about figuring that out, or just knowing yourself in that way and having the conversation with your partner prior to stepping into that monogamous long-term relationship. That's supposed to last till death do us part.
Right. And, I agree with what you just said, and I beat that drum an awful lot, but I have to acknowledge what the truth some of my clients bring up. But what if people lie? And so men say a lot of women lie, and of course the truth is a lot of people lie. And why do we lie? We lie because we're emotionally needy, lonely, and really trying hard to please the other person. So we say what we think the other person really wants to hear. And yeah, a lot of people do lie about that once the conversation gets started. But if you have even a reasonable amount of intelligence, you can kind of read the room and get a sense of what's going on. And, you don't just ask one question and then stop talking.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing conversation, and you compare behaviors to conversations and past history to the claim that is made by the person you're talking to, because it's just difficult for everybody to talk about honestly and openly.
Yeah. Well, I think to remedy that, or to combat it, or to improve your odds of the lying, one thing you said is no one in therapy has ever told me they've waited way too long before they got married.
Yeah.
So it's like just getting to know, like really get to know them. It's like, because you'll detect that lie, I feel like 6 months, a year in, prior to then jumping, moving things so fast to where you're living with each other, or where you're married or something like that. I think that's kind of a more intelligent way of doing it, like not rushing.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think that the corollary is also true, by the way, that I've never had anybody come into my office saying they got out of that relationship way too early.
Yeah.
So, we're kind of screwed up on our timing, and there's an old French saying that he who marries in haste repents at his leisure. And I think that's profoundly true, right? There's no rush. If the courtship is going well, if we're enjoying our partner, we're enjoying dating, getting to know them, or even enjoying living together, what's the rush?
Yeah.
I don't think that there is one anymore.
Well, it feels like it's like the societal rush still is like, for me, the pressure you feel from family, friends. I mean, even when I was in my 20s, people were getting married and they're asking you questions and they're trying to bring you into this like tribe of marriage, which is going to end like, and once they reach their 30s in divorce, which is what will happen to most of my friends.
Right.
But it feels like there's such a pressure to go into this thing, and it's like, this is the way it's done. You date someone, it just feels like a lot of pressure, I feel like.
Yeah, you were a man ahead of your time, obviously. Because
yeah.
at the age I was at 20, when I got married the first time, it was the norm. That was a normal age. And now with the current generation of people considering first marriages, the average first marriage takes place at age 30.
Yeah.
So you're still in your 30s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
1 year left.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Or not even like 6 months or less than that. It's ticking by.
So now you're really feeling the pressure. Yeah.
Why even let that go like completely? I mean, I feel like I had to let go of that idea of even getting married or anything, and just kind of like we talked about before, creating a life worth living and focusing on that and surrendering and letting what is going to come to me, and not wanting so much, not pressuring so much, just letting go of the idea of even having a lifelong partner. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. It's like, that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah. I think the statistic that's telling is from years ago, men who hadn't been married by age 40 usually had poor marital outcomes.
Yeah.
But the difference would be you have lived with girlfriends for prolonged periods of time. There was a marriage in everything but name. You simply didn't do the paperwork. And I think what's good about that for people who are watching what's happening in divorce courts is that it's so much less painful when you don't have the government involved in your separation from another person. You don't have to pay lawyers. You don't have to mess around with any of that. It starts getting complicated when life gets complicated. Children come along, people get ill or injured, and they go to the emergency room. And all of a sudden, if you're not married, you're not really recognized as having any kind of rights, or it's very confusing. So I think there are a lot of good reasons for people to get married. But to get married, the worst that I think I've ever heard of is getting married to please other people, followed closely by getting married so that we can have sex.
Yeah.
I think, but those are horrible reasons.
I have another good one for you.
Yeah, what's that?
When I was in college, somebody once said, "Yeah, I want to have kids just to see what they look like."
Oh gosh, kill me now.
So back
God.
to sex addiction. So it seems like it's kind of a responsibility thing and an awareness thing, and kind of what we're trying to do here by teaching people how to manage your sexuality intelligently. Those by applying the tools and the things that we're talking about, that is going to help that, I would assume.
I have to confess, I'm not really clear exactly what your question is when you say responsibility, but let me give a stab at it and see if this helps. If nothing else, as an adult, I mean, part of that definition of the word adult, it means that I'm responsible for myself and I am competent at taking care of myself. Mm-hmm. So that would include sexuality. So as an adult, if I get married and I'm not happy in my sex life, even despite having conducted a thorough, intentional interview leading up to the marriage, let's say I'm not getting touched in the way I want to get touched, or there's some other kind of problem, I get to fall back on human language and express that to my partner and say, hey, when you do this, I'm really not comfortable with that, or I really don't like it when we do this way. And I think everyone has a responsibility for doing that. And before we get involved in a relationship, we have a responsibility for knowing ourselves a bit, although it's so much easier, right, once we get into a sexual relationship. But we could all start off with masturbatory frequency when you're a single person and you're young, let's say 20 or 18 or 24, anything like that. You have some idea about how often you like pure sexual gratification. And I say pure in the most impure manner because what I mean is just simply sexual release, but without any kind of emotional connection. And then if you ask most people, the really good sex, even for people who've never had sex, they'd like to have it with another person. And if you ask further, do you mean just somebody who was willing because they got paid to have sex with you, or somebody who actually liked you enough that they wanted to take their clothes off and be with you that way? Just about everybody would prefer the latter rather than the former. So, because that's where we have a meaningful connection with another human being. So when I think of being responsible, and with your new goal of developing that life worth living, then you end up with the result that you have a life worth sharing. Not for everybody, because there are women by the thousands who are going to find you quite resistible. And it's the same for everybody else out there. But you are going to have your fair share of people who find you and your lifestyle endlessly fascinating. And out of that group of people, you are going to be able to pick someone who's compatible enough for you to feel content. And I think when you talk about sexuality in that sense, then we're talking about a sexual gourmet, because that's somebody who appreciates not just the titillation of a beautiful partner or a stimulating sexual experience on the surface, but somebody who's really looking for depth, for connection, for meaning, for some real spiritual context for the whole experience. And that isn't something that we seek out to get permission to make sex okay, like having our ticket punched so we can get in through the door. We do that because those are the things that make intercourse transcendent. So if you really like sex and you really want to have the good stuff, you kind of have to follow the formula of developing a life worth living, and meeting people who you find fascinating and letting them get to know you and you getting to know them, and seeing if maybe there's enough there for the two of you to form a partnership. And I like using that word partnership, despite the fact that in the age in which I was reared, partners always refer to gay couples. And I think more and more, as our society becomes increasingly secular, partnership is such a great term because it's not loaded with all the the historical freight of the words husband and wife.
Mm-hmm.
So I still like those words and I still use them regularly. But if one is trying to be precise or one it really wants to be understood by the other, the word partner really takes us to the philosophic notion of equality. And I know that there are people out there who are uncomfortable with the idea of feminism, but I'm not. And one of the most attractive concepts that feminists have always promoted is the notion of a relationship based on equality. And it solves so many problems that would otherwise throw a couple into a very dark place. So, that's probably something we should talk about at some point is, the importance of or feminism or what feminism has to offer in sexually intimate relationships. Because I think if you're not having sex with somebody you consider your equal, oh my God, then you are having sex with somebody who is in the role of either being a subservient or being a superior. So it's either like a parental figure or a boss, or it's a child figure or some other kind of dependent. And in either case, the idea is actually rather nauseating. To have to be with a partner who of her own free will chooses to be with you is what I think most of us ideally would like to have.
Yeah. Great. That was a great answer to the question. So you passed, even though it probably wasn't that clear, but I mean, what you said was what I was looking for.
Well, great.
So yeah, I think it's just it's just like people don't have these skills or they don't have these abilities. I mean, a lot of them, I know I didn't. And I think, again, it's about knowing yourself and knowing what you want and being able to express that and all that sort of stuff. And also the repression. Repression seems to be a big aspect of the sex, quote unquote, sex addiction.
Yeah. I don't know how anybody like you, for example, could be expected to know any of this when in our culture, knowledge is usually transmitted by teachers, by parents, by someone who's in a mentoring position with you. And literally, virtually no one talks about this. And there are plenty of, if I could use a Bible term, false prophets out there who are telling us one thing or another that we need to do or we should do. In the Unification Church, you're ordered to marry somebody. And like most cults, there can be no disagreement with the order. You just, this is who you're called to marry. God has revealed this to me, so get on with it. And they'll marry like 1,000 people at a time, none of whom actually have conducted an intentional interview. They don't know each other. It's pretty scary. I've talked to some of them, and it was not a good experience over time. Yeah. Initially, it's good. And part of the reason it's initially good is there's so many wonderful things about love and about sex. I'm getting my needs for attention met, my needs for affirmation, my needs for approval, and for affection. And all of these words are so wonderful and so meaningful, or they reflect meaningful concepts that reflect true human needs. So the idea of having sex with someone or someone who's willing to be married to me, of course, that's going to feel pretty great initially, unless you think too much about it, in which case it'll be terrifying. But for the people, then there's the business of life, and people get preoccupied with earning a living, managing children, trying to find a place to live. And that's one reason, the sheer busyness of modern life is one of the reasons why so many people stay as long as they do in unfulfilling relationships, because they were too busy to really take stock of the whole situation. But had you told them at the beginning, well, I'd like you to meet this person. They're going to be a great partner for you. Of course, they're going to have sex about 50% as often as you would like, and they're never going to really like you. Yeah. But I think it'll work out, and it's none of us would sign up for that.
Yeah.
But many of us stay with such relationships for years and years, including those poor women and men who put up with domestic violence or domestic abuse.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, had you told them before the marriage, well, of course, your partner's normalized abusive behavior of all kinds, physically and verbally, and they'll think nothing of putting you down or calling you names or just yelling at you whenever they're upset, and they'll be upset at least a couple times a month. And it's like, yeah, you just killed my buzz there. I'm not doing this. I'm not getting married. But we don't do that. No, I mean, people don't explain. You have to have a good relationship before you can have a safe relationship before you can have a good relationship. And I think most of us don't even know that. And once we've gone through an abusive relationship, we're still kind of shell-shocked. And what happened? Yeah. and for some of us who don't understand it, it becomes such a confusing and troubling problem that we end up not trusting anyone of the opposite sex. Women who don't trust any men, men who don't trust any women because they've been so hurt and taken advantage of. And I think we can do better than that. We can teach our children how to vastly improve the odds of success.
Yeah. Well, that's why we're here.
Yeah.
It's all on you, Steve.
Yes. And except for the swearing, I think your children should listen to these podcasts.
Yeah, it's almost like you're creating, if you do get in a relationship, you're creating the idea of sex addiction to attach onto you, or you're more inclined to become, again, a sex addict, even though it's not real, if you aren't aware of this stuff, if you aren't doing your due diligence and having this sort of stuff. Because I mean, for me, it's like I was in a relationship that wasn't sexually gratifying, or it was like the 50% thing, or, you know, something like that. And it was, your mind goes to crazy places and you start doing things that you typically wouldn't do. And,
oh my gosh. Yeah.
And it's like, it's not, if you continue to follow that because you're so desperate to get like your needs met. And then
I just finished reading a book called A Short History of the Earth. And I was reminded by the author that the rate of infidelity among human beings is extremely high.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be, I mean, if we ever believed in the concept of sex addiction, that would be a symptom of the problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
But instead, I think it's a symptom of the fact that we don't manage our sexuality intelligently, because I've yet to meet anyone who got married with the idea in the back of their mind, oh, I can hardly wait to cheat on this one.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
Everybody is thinking it's going to be happily ever after, but the rate of infidelity by men and women is well over 50%. So the idea that we're doing a good job of managing it and getting our sexual needs met is just, it flies in the face of the evidence. We are absolutely failing at managing our sexuality intelligently across the board, men and women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Have you had ever a client come to you and say, I'm a sex addict? And have you ever had that scenario?
Many. And it's always, it's kind of tragically tied up with their own spiritual journey. And they've bought the party line, hook, line, and sinker. And so they buy into that, or they're really trying hard not to lose their partner. Male or female, they're trying to, stabilize their marriage. And she typically is the one who thinks he typically is the sex addict. Sometimes it's reversed, but it's usually the male, because I think without question, women are much better at repression than men are. So he...
Otherwise, really quick, you would think that they'd be just as open to having more sex?
No. What I meant by that is... women are more capable of obedience to the rules.
Okay.
Whatever the rules are and wherever they come from, whether it's a religion like Islam or Christianity or Judaism, or it's just a personal set of beliefs, women in general tend to conform more closely to those beliefs because they are better at repression. I was in a a training where one woman asked, well, why are so many sex offenders males? And no, actually, the question, as I recall, I'm forgetting now, because the question was, who has the preponderance of clinically significant sexually deviant diagnoses, men or women? And the clinician said, oh, men, of course. And she nodded her head knowingly because it confirmed all of her biases. Mm-hmm. And then he said, but that, of course, is because women are so much better at repression. And she said, huh? What do you mean? And he said, well, he gave an example. He just asked the question, how many of the women in the audience collect shoes? And almost all the hands went up.
Yeah.
And then the questions started coming back. What do you mean collect shoes? And there's something sexual about people paying attention to feet and people giving you compliments about your shoes, and even the pain that some women go through in putting on shoes that are a size or two too small, mm-hmm. so that they can wear something fashionable, because it increases their sexual appeal, at least in their own eyes, if not others. And so, in general, we're going to see more men falling prey to this kind of problem behavior. But, everything in this universe is connected to everything else, and all of us humans are really connected to one another. So if my wife or if her husband has a problem with compulsive sexual behaviors, because that's the term I think that's more appropriate rather than sex addiction, then it affects the both of them, and it affects their marriage, it affects their children, it affects their life and their finances and everything else going on in their lives. So most of the people who come to my office complaining of sex addiction, they've already self-diagnosed. Mm-hmm. And
where do they get that from?
Well,
is it just like me, like David the company did it?
Yeah, right.
I saw the show. What was the show? Californication, wasn't that?
Yes, exactly. And the whole gerbil story and all of that. So I think that when we talk, it's a little bit like calling a woman some vile put down like slut or whore, because some women will buy into that and think, well, yes, I am a slut, or yes, I am a whore, and kind of wear that moniker proudly. But I think all of this stuff is really putting down something within the range of normal human sexuality, or it exposes a sexual problem that could have been solved sexually just by thinking it through and, living within our own personal morals. I never try to get my clients to live within my moral code. I don't know how that shoe would ever fit. But if, I have yet to meet someone who doesn't have a moral code of their own.
Yeah.
And so whatever is right for my clients, I ask them that, it is definitely possible to live within that moral code unless, and here's the exception, and sadly it's all too common. There's an old Greek myth about Procrustes, who was an ancient robber baron from centuries and centuries ago, millennia ago. And Procrustes was known as a vicious and cruel man whose men would bring travelers who were trying to pass through his land. They would bring the travelers to his castle, and they would be forced, one and all, to spend the night on his bed. He had a bed infamously crafted of iron, which is a nice little bit of a meme from ancient history, referring to something that's rigid and unyielding in comparison to human flesh. And those who were too short were put on the rack and stretched to fit the bed. Those who were too tall were summarily amputated somewhere below the knees so that they could fit the bed. The point is, everybody fit the bed. Mm-hmm. One size fits everybody, which really, we don't do that with anything else when it comes to our humanity. We don't do that with clothing. We don't do that with diets, with workouts, with educations, but we try to do it with sexuality, and it has horrible outcomes. Mm-hmm. So that's But when I talk to my clients who are not doing well, they think they're sex addicts, and I ask them, well, can you describe to me what would be your ideal sex life?
Mm-hmm.
It's always something that would have generalized appeal. They generally want to have one partner. They'd like to settle down. They'd like to be free of excessive sexual desire, just getting their sexual needs met and going on living their lives.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I was referring to when I was talking to values, because it doesn't include the people who are still awaiting their night in the castle of Pythagoras.
Yeah.
Because once you spend a night there, you're really not so big on those rigid, unyielding moral codes. They don't really fit everyone.
Do people ever get upset if you tell them that it's not a thing? Like, it seems like a few times, sometimes people get upset with you about saying that sex addiction isn't a thing. Like you said, compulsive sexual behaviors. That seems more of a...
Right, because I can have compulsive eating behaviors, I can cleaning behaviors, avoidance of cleaning behaviors. I can be human beings can be compulsive about just about anything, because compulsive behavior is the remedy to the self-diagnosed, self-treated remedy, at least for anxiety. So if I have anxiety, I might do the same thing over and over and have it give me comfort, and of course it becomes a very good thing, except if I find out that other people disapprove and they're somewhat not just disapproving but mocking of me, then I'm going to start keeping it secret. But yeah, sexuality can be just as compulsive as anything else.
Yeah. Why don't they call it that? Just rather this like we treat compulsive sexual behaviors, or is it just not as sexy, or is it because sex addiction is so built into the mind of the zeitgeist of, the population, to where it just sells easier or something? Or?
Well, I don't think I've come across as too friendly to religion in these podcasts. And it's not that I hate religion, but I hate what religion typically does with sex, because it turns all of this into a sin. And it's a little bit like where we were, say, 50 years ago, or even 20 years ago, when we were talking about addiction to substances. And we created a whole occupational field called the drug and alcohol counselor. And those counselors are licensed to deal with drug and alcohol problems, but not anything deeper or more integrated into the problem, like early childhood trauma, for example. But if you ask most drug addicts, why do you use? And they've had a little bit of therapy, they're trying to avoid feelings. And usually those feelings are quite parallel to the traumatic feelings they experienced when they were young.
Yeah.
So in the early days of drug and alcohol treatment, the focus was on sobriety alone. And we'd count the number of days of sobriety, which is still a valid metric to kind of measure success. But it's certainly not the only metric, because one can be clean of alcohol and other drugs, but still be a miserable human being. And many alcoholics who've just toughed it out on their own without going to AA or any other place for help, they don't drink, but they're horrible people to be around. So we really haven't, offered them a holistic solution. And it's the same with sex. Once we identify something like drunkenness as a sin, then the focus is on eliminating the sin. And it's, of course, much more true of sex than it is with drunkenness, because there's virtually, there's so many ways to sin with sex, and very few ways in which sex is considered okay. For some religious people, it's only okay if you're intentionally planning on getting pregnant, which when you get to my age, I don't know where that would leave older people, but older people do have sex, and they don't have sex to have children anymore. They have sex because of all those other reasons. It's a way to share intimacy, closeness, to feel loved, to feel valued, and it's also pleasurable. Yeah. So Oh, and footnote, if it's not pleasurable, you're doing it wrong. So, yeah. So, that's how I see it, at least.
Okay. And then what about, what was I going to say? So just people like resisting it, like people having, like, what would you like to see? Like, how would you like to see sex addiction be treated or talked about? I guess we're kind of explaining how to go about that, but it's like, would you?
Yeah, I cringe at the idea of being self-promoting, but one of the first books I ever wrote was "We're All Like This," and it was a very, very simple explanation of the variety of human sexual needs. And I think if we could all start with the basic knowledge of our sexual needs, this book, in fact, became a college textbook. But I assure anybody listening, it's not hard to read. It's still available. But if once you know your sexual needs and you know that they're more than just craving physical release, then you can begin building your life intelligently around getting those needs met. And in the sex addiction model, those needs are not really legitimate because they are merely desires. Mm. So my need for sexual connection, my need for sexual approval, my need for even, let's say, sexual information, those are all very suspicious in certain quarters. And that's why I have had people who've been very upset that I didn't agree with their self-diagnosis of sex addiction. Yeah. But when you look at anybody who is acting out sexually, there's always a story that makes a lot more sense of the problem than that they are addicted to sex. Mm-hmm. I'm reminded of a client I had years and years ago who was wondering why he was so in love with pornography, and particularly the detestable kind of pornography that he liked. And it took years of therapy for him to finally realize this was not a religious issue, that he didn't need to necessarily turn to the Lord, but that what he really did need to do was to come to grips with his trauma of his childhood and the fact that he had been abused, not intentionally perhaps, but at least unintentionally, by his mentally ill mother, his very abusive stepmother, and the idea of women being abused in pornographic situations to him was very satisfying. Mm. And he was so angry with women, but it never occurred to him that thing inside of him that called out for violence against women, that it actually had an origin. Mm. And that once he understood the origin, that proverbial light bulb went off in his brain, and he realized, oh, I've been working out my childhood issues for the last 20 years. Wow. Yeah, so I think every one of us has a story like that helps us to understand both the good and the bad of ourselves sexually, the things we like we wish we didn't like, the things we like that are really no good for us to like. There are explanations for all of that. Mm. So coming to understand, I think, is going to be helped if people would read a book like that. And it was later picked up and distributed nationally, at least in excerpted forms, by McGraw-Hill. And I think that it was the best book on human sexual needs. I'm sad to say, because it was the only book on human sexual needs. Yeah. How can I manage my sexuality intelligently if I don't even know what my needs are? It would be like managing my nutrition plan without knowing anything about vitamins. Mm-hmm. That makes no sense at all. Yeah. So, we kid ourselves when we think, oh, because I've had sex, therefore I know all about that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Nobody's got anything to tell me about that. And that's just not true. It's a nearly infinite in scope sort of subject.
Well, hearing you talk about that too reminds me of, like, it just popped in my head. So sex addiction, actually, if you do go to a treatment center, that costs probably thousands of dollars.
Yeah, 30 to 45,000 a month.
But it seems like it then leads to more repression in a way, because it's telling you not to do things, but your way of attack and your way of viewing it is by saying, hey, we are sexual beings, we have sexual needs, here's what they are, and like telling them and explaining them to people in a way where you more so embrace your sexuality. Whereas sex addiction, it's like you're doing something wrong. You're here because you have a problem.
Yeah, I was blaming religion, earlier for some of this, and really one of the men I was talking to reminded me that we have to look at ourselves as well, because a lot of this sex addiction behavior is around our fearing facing the reality of our own situation. And, that, oops, I have made a terrible, terrible mistake. Mm-hmm. So the guy who was gay and married a woman because his church was saying that, you have to turn away from this. It's a sin. And, you'll get over it once you get into a marriage with a woman. And obviously there were sexual behaviors after that led him to coming to my office. And in the same way, even pastors, I've had multiple pastors come in through my program, and they know that they should be happy with the wife that they have, and that she's a wonderful, sweet woman, and she is not nearly the sexual monster that he is. And so they want more and more to be just like her. And if successful, they can become just like her at the risk of doing themselves tremendous violence, on their interior. So, and also denying her the opportunity to see who he really is. Because I think for a lot of women, if they just knew who their husband really was and what he was really all about and what he liked and didn't like, there are a lot of women who would have said, yeah, absolutely, no problem. Why didn't you tell me?
Yeah.
And he didn't tell anybody because he was ashamed and uncomfortable with himself.
Yeah.
It's really kind of a form of body dysmorphia if you think about it, because it's like being ashamed of needing to eat more than the person sitting next to you, and trying to like look like you're eating less, and or being shamed by one of your parents into cleaning your plate and forcing yourself to eat more than you want. Mm-hmm. We do the same thing sexually.
Yeah. And what's something you could give somebody as far as advice goes, as far as if they do feel like they're struggling in this way? I mean, they obviously could talk to a therapist. They could read We're All Like This.
I think the therapy suggestion is fraught with potential conflict, because many frustrated religious people became licensed therapists in the last 20 years.
Okay.
And what they do in their therapy, sadly, is a lot of preaching, but in the name of psychotherapy. And even that's why we still struggle with the notion of conversion therapy, where gay clients still have therapists out there who are trying to talk them into not being gay. So, but it's a similar thing to try to tell a man he shouldn't, or a woman, they shouldn't want sex as often as they want it. Can't you just do something else, like go for a walk or take a cold shower or turn to the Lord in prayer? And although those may all be great ideas, they are not a substitute one for the other. So I can distract myself by busyness, by becoming a workaholic or an alcoholic or a shopaholic or a gambler, but I still have to deal eventually with my sexuality at some point. And if I don't, it's going to cause me tremendous problems. So I think people need to kind of go forward with caution, and maybe asking if they're interviewing therapists, which I think they should do in the first session, with a money back guarantee, hopefully, if you're not satisfied, and if your therapist can't respond positively to the idea that you'd like to learn how to manage your sexuality intelligently, that you seem to be wanting sex more than other people do, but you'd like to find an honorable and legal way to express your sexuality. And if you don't get anything positive from the therapist at that point, you have to say, thank you for your time, and get up and walk out.
Yeah.
Because it's just not safe.
Yeah. So it seems like the main thing is acceptance, that it's okay for the majority of people out there, if what they want sexually is okay.
Yeah, although, I say that, and I know there's got to be some pedophile out there who's thinking, yeah, that's who I am. I just need to accept myself. And no, pedophilia is a mental disorder, and we know that because it causes significant distress or impairment in terms of both the law, and they would say, well, the law hasn't caught up yet. It's like the law against being gay, and maybe there's some truth to that. But then there's the whole issue of consent.
Yeah,
and none of us believe children are capable of giving consent. So sex between consenting adults, and I'm not even limiting that to two, but for a whole gang of consenting adults to be able to do what they want, I don't have a problem with. I don't want to, be guilty of trying to control adults and their sexuality. But I do think we all have a very important job in protecting the sexually vulnerable from sexual exploitation.
Yeah. So it's doing it acceptance, but then legally and honorably. That's how you put it typically.
Yeah, that's exactly how I put it. So within the confines of the community's values, which would be legality, and my own values, which would be honorably.
Yeah.
So I've talked to so many men who believe a certain sexual behavior is very, very wrong, and there's no way they would do it unless, and this is very telling, unless I say, well, but what if your wife met you at the door and said, honey, I couldn't figure out what to give you for your birthday this year, so I set up this thing. And every man I've ever talked to looks at me with some suspicion and says something about it being a setup. It couldn't possibly happen. It couldn't be true. And I'm not saying that we need to be doing coloring outside the lines or doing anything that we would normally not do, because what's going on inside of us is that there are really almost two people. There is still that inner teenager who just wants what he wants. My inner psychopath just impulsively wants whatever he wants. So I want all the women, and I want all the sex, and I want to have sex all day long. But really, when I think about it, no, I really love my wife. I really love my life with her. My marriage means a lot to me. I may have desire for others, but then the adult in me goes through the thinking it through, what they call in AA, thinking the drink through. And I'll let the listeners figure out what you'd have to think through. But to think it through and realize, I don't really want that drama in my life.
Yeah.
So if you're building a life worth living, then you probably don't want the crazy drama of people being lied to and infidelity or inviting relative strangers. I went through a lot of effort to interview my wife before we got married, and the idea that she might spontaneously invite some stranger into our bedroom, that scares the crap out of me. I mean, that is not going to have a good outcome, most likely.
No.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good place to end. So we'll wrap things up with the listener question that we have.
Sure.
So again, if you have a question for Steve, visit stevening.com and fill out the contact form. So this week's question is, hi, Steve. I have heard you mention spiritual intimacy, and that's in quotes. Do you think two people can have that if they have different religions, or if one is religious and the other is a non-believer?
Great question. And the answer is absolutely yes. Just like with sexual anatomy, we don't have to have the same genitalia to have sexual intimacy. We don't have to have the same brains to have intellectual intimacy. And to have spiritual intimacy, what we do have to have in all of these areas is the ability to make it safe for us to share our spirituality with one another. And our spirituality is really about our values, our morals, and our ethics. So we've got values kind of guiding us through life, and everybody has values, whether they know it or not. And we all have ethics and morals that guide us, little rules that guide us through life. So accepting that we're all different and that we can't control each other is the first step toward making it safe. And I guess the key word there is tolerance. And it goes back to what we were talking about in a podcast earlier, that getting to know other people is a deep and very sacred pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And having somebody share their spirituality with me, no matter how different it might be, it's really an honor to have somebody open up their life like that and share their very private, intimate thoughts. And I, for one, I could easily see myself involved with a partner who believed in Buddhism or some other religion or philosophy, and I don't need to have any of those beliefs to enjoy the marriage. I could feel very close to that person as long as we both bring tolerance into the conversation.
That's great. That's a real mature way of looking at it. Because I think when I was younger, I'd probably be like, they have to be like this or they have to be like that. Or I've heard people have that discussion too, like when I was in my 20s or 30s, and people saying, well, we have to have this. This is one of the main things, like religion or spirituality in line.
Right. I hear so many people say that. And we have to be a little more forgiving of ourselves, because we say that because that's what we were taught.
Mm-hmm.
But when you think about it, you'll remember that there are people in the same religions who have absolutely awful marriages.
Yeah.
And they don't share any spiritual intimacy at all. And then there are wonderful people you could date who might be as different as could possibly be, but with whom you could have the most enchanting, wonderful conversations, as long as you're both embracing tolerance.
Great. I love how you put that. So thank you for that question, and thanks, Steve. And that wraps up the show for today. So thank you all for listening. Thank you, Steve, and we'll catch you all later.